US-China tensions are sharpening once again, and this time, it's hitting on two critical fronts: cybersecurity and trade. According to Reuters, the US is investigating a malware email attack traced to APT41, a notorious group tied to Chinese intelligence. This wasn't just a random cybercrime. The targets were carefully chosen: trade groups, law firms, and even government agencies, the kind of institutions that handle sensitive negotiations and legal frameworks shaping US-China relations. This is cyber warfare by another name. Not tanks or missiles, but code and data breaches designed to give Beijing leverage in the shadows. At the same time, the economic picture is darkening. China Briefing reports that over the first 8 months of 2025, bilateral trade between the US and China has collapsed by more than 14%. Chinese exports to America are down nearly 16% compared to last year. This isn't just a slowdown, it's evidence of an accelerating decoupling between the world's two largest economies. Supply chains are being rerouted, companies are relocating, and both sides are quietly preparing for a future where economic interdependence no longer acts as a brake on confrontation. Put the two together, cyber attacks and collapsing trade, and the picture becomes clear. Washington and Beijing are moving from uneasy rivals to outright strategic adversaries, contesting every domain: markets, technology, and now the battlefield of information itself. The question is no longer whether the US and China are drifting apart. The question is how long before this Cold War begins to burn hotter. This week, a quiet but critical event shook the backbone of global connectivity. Undersea internet cables in the Red Sea were cut, triggering widespread disruptions across Asia and the Middle East. At first glance, this might seem like a technical issue, but undersea cables are the arteries of the modern world, carrying over 95% of global internet traffic, from financial transactions to government communications and military coordination. When they're cut, entire economies feel the ripple. The Red Sea, in particular, is one of the most strategic digital corridors on Earth. It links Europe to Asia through Egypt's Suez Canal region. A disruption here doesn't just slow down video calls. It has the potential to choke the flow of global commerce, reroute financial trades, and destabilize entire regions that rely on these connections for stability. The question now is how those cables were cut. Was it an accident? A ship's anchor dragging along the seabed? Or was it sabotage? In an age of hybrid warfare, undersea cables are a tempting target. Strike them, and you don't need bombs to destabilize nations. You just need to sever the invisible threads that tie the digital world together. For Asia and the Middle East, the immediate impact has been slower speeds, outages, and disruptions to key services. But the long-term signal is far more alarming. If global infrastructure this vital can be disrupted so easily, then the vulnerabilities in our interconnected world are far greater than most want to admit. The Red Sea cable cuts are not just about the internet. They're a warning shot, showing just how fragile global stability really is when one break in the chain can send shockwaves across continents. The Middle East was shaken this week by a strike that many are calling a turning point. Israel launched an airstrike in Doha, Qatar, targeting Hamas political leaders who were meeting there. Among the dead was a Qatari security official, a fact that makes this operation far more than just another regional clash. For Israel, it was a tactical hit. For the Gulf states, it was something else entirely, a violation of sovereignty. The reaction was swift. Governments across the region condemned the strike. And outside the Middle East, China added its voice, warning of dangerous escalation and openly challenging Israel's actions on the world stage. But the most significant response came from Qatar itself. Within hours, it convened an emergency Arab-Islamic summit, pulling leaders together to consider collective security responses. The symbolism is unmistakable. When sovereignty is breached in such a direct way, even wealthy Gulf monarchies begin to wonder whether the US, their traditional guarantor of stability, can still be relied upon. That's the deeper story here. The strike didn't just kill Hamas officials. It cracked the facade of Gulf security, reminding smaller states that they are vulnerable, not only to Iran, but now to Israel as well. And if they can't depend on Washington to restrain its closest ally, then the entire balance of the region begins to shift. In a part of the world where alliances are fragile and perception is everything, Israel's decision to strike in Doha may prove to be a geopolitical earthquake, one that accelerates the Gulf's search for new partners and potentially redraws the lines of trust in the Middle East. For decades, the security narrative in the Gulf has been simple. Iran is the threat, Israel is the counterbalance. But that equation is beginning to fracture, and Israel itself is now being viewed by Gulf leaders as a destabilizing force. The turning point came with Israel's airstrike in Doha. By crossing into Qatari territory to target Hamas leaders, Israel didn't just eliminate an enemy, it violated sovereignty in a region where political legitimacy rests on respect for borders. For Gulf monarchies, that act set off alarm bells louder than any speech from Tehran. The logic is shifting. If Israel is willing to strike deep inside a Gulf state, then no Arab capital is truly safe. And the message is clear. Israel's regional strategy is not about stability. It's about unilateral action, regardless of the consequences for its neighbors. The ripple effects are already visible. Gulf states are reassessing the foundations of their security partnerships. Once, Israel was quietly seen as an ally against Iran's ambitions. Now it risks being seen as just another unpredictable power, one that can destabilize as easily as deter. This perception shift matters. The Gulf sits at the crossroads of global energy markets and military supply lines. If its rulers begin to see both Iran and Israel as threats, they may turn increasingly to other powers, China, Russia, or new coalitions within the Islamic world, to guarantee their survival. In a region already defined by fragile alliances, Israel's actions may have transformed its image from counterweight to catalyst, the very thing pushing the Gulf into new and uncertain hands. This October, OPEC Plus will move to increase oil output by about 137,000 barrels per day. On paper, it's a modest adjustment, but in geopolitics, even small shifts in production send powerful signals. Analysts see the move as an attempt to stabilize supply in the face of turbulent global demand. With energy markets rattled by war in the Middle East, slowing trade between the US and China, and widespread fears of global recession, oil producers are walking a tightrope. Too little supply and prices spike, hurting consumers worldwide. Too much and revenues collapse, straining producers who rely on oil to balance their budgets. For OPEC Plus, the calculation is both economic and political. The group is signaling that it intends to remain the center of gravity in global energy, even as renewable pushes and US shale production challenge its influence. This decision also serves as a reminder to Washington and Brussels. The levers of energy security are still controlled in Riyadh, Moscow, and the wider cartel. The 137,000 barrel increase may appear cautious, but caution is exactly the point. OPEC Plus is hedging against volatility, projecting steadiness at a moment when the global system feels anything but stable. Behind the numbers, the message is simple. In a fragmented world, energy producers still hold the power to dictate the tempo of global markets. And that leverage is one of the last constants in a rapidly shifting geopolitical order. London erupted on September 13th as tens of thousands filled the streets for a far-right rally branded Unite the Kingdom. The protests centered on one of the most divisive issues in British politics: immigration. Marchers demanded tighter borders and an end to what they called uncontrolled migration, but the rally didn't go unanswered. Counter-protesters flooded the streets, clashing with demonstrators and police. By the day's end, London was left with the images of a country increasingly split down the middle. Immigration has long been a flashpoint in British politics, fueling the Brexit referendum, reshaping elections, and now sparking mass mobilization in the capital. But the scale of this protest signals something deeper, an intensifying identity crisis. The far right frames the issue as a fight for cultural survival. The left sees it as a mask for xenophobia and fear. And caught in between are millions of ordinary Britons who see rising costs, strained services, and a political class struggling to deliver answers. What happened on September 13th is more than just another street rally. It's a barometer of Europe's wider pressures, where migration, economics, and identity collide. Across the continent, similar protests are gaining ground, from Germany to Italy to France. The question now for Britain: does this unrest remain a political spectacle, or does it harden into a movement capable of reshaping policy and power? One thing is certain: The UK is not alone. This is part of a continental wave that could redraw the future of Europe itself. Turkey has entered another turbulent chapter, one marked by mass arrests, corruption crackdowns, and deepening political instability. This week, authorities carried out sweeping operations across multiple provinces, arresting dozens of suspected ISIS members. On the surface, it looks like a decisive strike against terrorism. But in Turkey, security moves often carry a double edge, blending genuine counterterrorism with political calculation. At the same time, Istanbul was shaken by the arrest of a district mayor and dozens of municipal officials accused of corruption. Supporters say it's accountability long overdue. Critics argue it's part of a familiar pattern, using legal tools to weaken rivals and consolidate power. For years, Turkey has walked a fine line, a NATO ally on paper, yet increasingly charting its own course between East and West. Internally, President Erdogan's government has relied on purges, arrests, and pressure on institutions to maintain control. These latest moves suggest that the state's grip is tightening once again under the banner of security and justice. The broader risk is that each wave of crackdowns erodes what's left of Turkey's democratic fabric, fueling resentment at home while raising questions abroad about Ankara's reliability as a partner. At the same time, the fight against ISIS remains real, and instability inside Turkey has ripple effects for Syria, Iraq, and Europe's security. The arrests this week show us a country fighting threats on two fronts: external terrorism and internal dissent. The question is whether Turkey is strengthening its foundations or slowly hollowing them out from within. Stay informed on the world's shifting power. Subscribe to the Watchtower report, where strategy meets reality.